You're listening to Radio Maria, a Christian voice in your home. We now present the Quest for a Culture of Life in America with Steve Koob.
Hello, Radio Maria listeners. It's so good to be back with you. I'm back in Ohio after 2 weeks on the road, and so it's good to be back. And I'm excited about our program today. Our guest is Bai Macfarlane. Bai is the founder and president of Mary's Advocates, an apostolate that supports those who remain faithful to marriage after separation and divorce. So we're going to learn more about Mary's Advocates. We're going to learn more about what the church really has to say about annulments and some of the things that it says, but the dioceses don't necessarily do. So Bai is going to educate us on what the Catechism says and what canon law says and what the church actually does. So Bai, are you there?
Yes, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Again, thank you for being with us. I wasn't sure you were there. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? You live in Ohio, I believe, and you started this apostolate, but you didn't start it out of the blue. I mean, you have a life situation.
Right. I'm a Northeastern Ohio suburban girl, went to Catholic schools, graduated from the University of Notre Dame, met my husband there. We were married about 25 years ago, had 4 children, when my husband decided to leave the marriage. And I had no idea what goes on in divorce courts at that time. I was busy raising my kids, and my eyes were opened when I learned what happens in no-fault divorce. And then in my whole upbringing, I kind of have been aware that sometimes people who say they're promoting Catholic teaching are actually incorrect. So when I started looking into what the church says about divorce, I was having some of those same yellow flags pop up where it's like, this doesn't sound right. And the more I researched, the more I confirmed that my original feelings were correct, that what's going on in the United States not only isn't right regarding Catholics and no-fault divorce, and the annulment issue is another entanglement that I think has helped contribute to the problem. So I started a nonprofit educational organization that I've just been doing on and off for 10 years and connecting with other people who found the same thing I found, and we were supporting each other.
So what do you do to support each other?
Well, I think the thing that's most appreciated when people find us is that we're a network of those who support each other remaining faithful even after separation and divorce. The culture says that when a marriage is divorced, the marriage is over, it's ended, you're single again, when are you going to start dating? Are you going to find a new spouse? And with the prevalence of annulment, a lot of Catholics think that way too. So we support each other when we know we're still married. Just because somebody's spouse abandoned them doesn't mean they're not married. Just like, say you had a son or a daughter who was defiant, rebellious, causing all sorts of issues, left the home. We don't say, he's not my son anymore. He's still my son. So we say that, my husband is still my husband. Just because he's not with me and we're civilly divorced doesn't mean he's not my husband. And there's a beautiful book that we worked to get translated from Italian to English called The Gift of Self. And this book contains a marriage renewal promise where we kind of go through a different version of marriage promises where we're still faithful to our spouse. And the prayer of renewing the marriage vows in this book are also promulgated by the Pontifical Council of the Family. So I feel like we're supported from those that higher up.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about marriages that are annulled? Do you still consider yourself married?
No, the people in our network, if two tribunals have both agreed, the people in our network usually end up appealing. If a U.S. first instance tribunal says that a marriage is invalid, rulings for invalidity of marriage don't have any weight unless two tribunals, two court systems have looked at them from two different dioceses. So the people who I know where their spouse wants to act like they're not married and they petition for an annulment, if the spouse petitions for an annulment, the people in my network would defend our annulment because we believe our marriages are valid, and there's some resources we use. So if the United States tribunal says a marriage is invalid, anybody has the right to ask that Rome, the tribunal of the Roman Rota, be the tribunal that would give it a second review. So I know people who have asked that to be done, and then Rome comes back and said the U.S. tribunal was in error.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely believe that there are circumstances where there is such a thing that a marriage is invalid. The confusion comes up when we have simplistic explanations flying around on the internet or on YouTube where somebody will just say, oh, if you're immature, you didn't know what you're doing, or, your marriage broke down, that's kind of proof that the marriage is invalid. And that's not how it goes. I mean, it's kind of hard to get into all the complexities on a radio interview right now, but two recent books have been published that are crystal clear, and they're just wonderful. One of them by Ignatius Press that has a preface by Cardinal Raymond Burke, who used to be in charge of the Signatura, which is the highest tribunal in the whole world. And this book on when is the marriage null goes through all the different grounds for annulment, and it explains what is and what is not really a ground for annulment. So this is very helpful for people like us who want to defend our marriages in tribunals.
I think the title of it includes the word nullity, right?
Yeah, this one, When is the Marriage Null? Guide to the Grounds of Matrimonial Nullity for Pastors, Counselors, and Lay Faithful. I mean, the book's like 3/4 of an inch thick, and it has dozens of pages on the 1 Canon 1095, which is commonly used in the United States, where a tribunal will decide that someone's not married because they just didn't have the capacity to consent to marriage. And that one is one that is overturned at the Rota. Two of my sources are former Roman Rota judges. After we have the U.S. system for tribunals, the level of appeal outside of the United States is the Tribunal of the Roman Rota. And two of their judges have corresponded with me. One of them recently retired. He's Kenneth Okafola. And he has said that one of the reasons that a lot of these annulments get overturned is that the first instance tribunal will have proofs in the record that don't really conclude nullity at all, but they'll still say the marriage was invalid. Or they'll misinterpret what the law is supposed to mean about grounds for invalidity. And he also says the third reason was, procedural violations. Like the tribunals will kind of bowl over some of the rights of a person trying to defend their marriage, and that's not okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, in every annulment request, there is a defender of the bond. There is someone on the tribunal that attempts to show that the marriage is valid. And then, of course, the petitioner is trying to claim and justify his claim that the marriage is invalid. Now, in the United States, I see in one of your comments, one diocese, a man reports that there were 161 requests for annulment, and all 161 were granted. And there's a pretty high percentage of granting of annulments within the United States, and I don't know how that goes from diocese to diocese. But what about how often do people request or challenge the annulment decision to Rome, and what is the effect?
I don't have any source to know the answer to that question. Mm-hmm. I just know that in people in my network, if a first instance tribunal would say that your marriage is invalid,
they would appeal.
They would appeal and appeal to Rome.
And what's the typical result for those appeals?
A lot of the people I know, they come back and their marriage is vindicated. There's one kind of thing that's called the whole case is thrown out because the procedural violations were so extreme that the record wasn't even good enough to make a judgment about. So that's called nullity of the entire sentence, where the Roman Rota would come back and tell the U.S. tribunal, basically, the job was botched so terribly, and things that were supposed to be done and rights that were supposed to be protected weren't.
Mm-hmm.
That happens sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Now, the coming synod, the ordinary synod on the family, it's piggybacking on the extraordinary synod, which talked a lot about how the annulment process might be streamlined, could be made less expensive, could be take less time, less involved, and so they're kind of trying to make it easier, it seems like, to get an annulment, or at least to apply for an annulment.
Right, that's definitely what the press is telling us. I've seen interviews with Cardinal Raymond Burke. Again, he was in charge of the highest appeal tribunal in the whole world, even above the Tribunal of the Roman Rota. And Cardinal Raymond Burke says that the issue isn't that we have a problem with the process that's required. The issue is that we need people who are trained to follow the process.
Okay.
Like, for one example, some tribunals start the process with having a petitioner fill out a questionnaire. There might be 40 questions on there. If someone answers all of these in paragraph forms, they might be composing, 30, 50, 70 pages, answering this long questionnaire about all these different possible things. Well, canon law says the case is supposed to start with a petition that names the grounds for invalidity that the person's charging applies to their marriage, and then the petition is supposed to describe in a general way the facts and proofs that support that charge against the marriage. I mean, I kind of think of, that's kind of simple compared to answering a long questionnaire that might take you 30 to 50 pages. So if they follow the process, and then I've also heard that different countries do not have the same situation that the United States has. Statistics that I had seen that describe the percentage of all the annulments granted in the world and how much of those percentages are granted in the United States. Like in the late 80s, 60-70% of the annulments in the entire world were being granted in the United States. But maybe in other countries, they might not have a tribunal set up at all. I've seen an article where Pope Francis was talking about problems with nullity, and some places where he was in Argentina, if someone was going to participate in a process, they might have to drive 240 kilometers. I don't know what kilometers is in miles, Steve. Do you?
You're embarrassing me. No, I don't know.
Well, anyways, it's driving far. So if you're if you're a rural person and you're of medium income, and the only way you're going to participate in a nullity case is to drive to some diocesan office that's, maybe you don't even own a car, to make someone do that, that is a problem.
Yes.
So if we could streamline that kind of stuff, I have some ideas about that, but so I'm listening. We hear what the news says about how, there's a push to streamline and make it easier and free, but then I go see what Cardinal Raymond Burke has to say, and Cardinal Raymond Burke is saying the process is not the problem. It's people knowing how to do the process. And I just gave you the one example of telling someone to fill in 70 pages of a questionnaire. That's intimidating as compared to let's have an interview over the phone with someone who's an expert in canon law, and let's write, 1 or 2 pages. And there you go. You're ready to start your case.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're going to be speaking in Rome at a conference entitled The Two Shall Become One. It's a symposium on marriage in Rome on one day, September 26th, sponsored by Human Life International and the Koob Center for the Study of Creation. Now, you'll be talking about what does canon law have to say, and what does the Catechism of the Catholic Church have to say, and what is actually done in the dioceses of the United States. Can you, without getting too technical, tell us what canon law tells the
Sure,
dioceses to do?
sure. Let's go back in history 100 years ago. 100 years ago, if a man abandoned his wife, the civil court system and the sheriff might consider him having committed a crime. He might be thrown in jail. If someone's committing adultery, the idea of forcing small children to go spend overnight visits with mommy and her new adultering partner was unthinkable. So that's what was going on maybe 100 years ago. And then what's happened with the advent of no-fault divorce, I mean, in the civil forum, as we're seeing everywhere, marriage has nothing to do with permanence. It has nothing to do with exclusive use of our sexual powers. Procreative powers are recreational sport. So what the catechism and the canon law say is supposed to happen with separations is kind of more like what was happening 100 years ago. So if everyone was following the catechism and canon law, when a spouse was very unhappy about their marriage, they might or might not have a morally legitimate reason to separate. I mean, everybody sins against their spouse, but some of those sins are so bad that the other spouse has a reason to separate. So Catholics are only supposed to be physically separated from their spouse, those who marry in the Catholic rite of marriage, when only certain grave offenses have occurred. And
Is there a list?
the canon law says, go ahead.
Is there a list of those in the canon law or in the catechism?
Not exactly. Adultery is absolutely on the list. Then the other description that the canon law uses is the things like causing physical or moral harm or making common conjugal life unduly difficult. So because the canon law only gives, this phrase, 10 words or so, it's not up to every priest to interpret what that means. There is a system in the church that has been designated to interpret what these things mean, and it's the jurisprudence from the Roman Rota and other authoritative decisions. Like if a pope wrote a decision, or the Roman Rota or the Signatura wrote a decision, or the Council of Trent had something to say. So there is commentary that defines what that grounds for separation. And you know how we have the Pontifical Council of the Family? People have heard of that. We also have the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, CDF. People have heard of that. Well, there's another Pontifical Council for the interpretation of legislative text, and they're the ones who are responsible for canon law. And a source that they recommend is exegetical commentary. I mean, the name of it's so long, nobody cares. But separation is morally justified if marriage is too difficult, if three conditions are met, according to this commentary that the Pontifical Council of Legislative Text recommends. And the three conditions would be that if the offense is truly dangerous, then the offense has to be repeated, and separation has to be the only way to bring safety. So, I mean, if someone is saying that they've fallen out of love with their spouse, or they're very unhappy, or they think he's annoying or she's annoying, is that dangerous? Is that repeatedly dangerous? No, it's not. And what's happening is that people in marriages, and what I see is people in marriages feel dissatisfied. They're unhappy about it. And because the church is silent about these canon laws on separation of spouses, and because the people know that everyone who petitions for annulment gets an annulment, I'm imagining that people who are dissatisfied with their marriage think that the solution is that, I should get a divorce, because divorce is for people who are very unhappy, and I should get my annulment, because everyone who asks for an annulment gets one, and then I'll go find my second marriage that would really work.
Mm-hmm. And, you have to be civilly divorced before you can even apply for an annulment. Is that correct?
I would say that's not correct.
Okay. It
is the policy in the United States that is required. But canon law has this other whole step that what's required is the bishop's permission before anyone would file for a civil divorce. Canon law
before
says you can't go get a civil divorce on your own authority. You can't just decide amongst your girlfriends or your parish priest that you're so unhappy and you're going to go get a civil divorce. That is not allowed. And people don't, and that's not followed.
Well, how could any priest or bishop stop a man from getting a no-fault divorce from his wife without
Exactly.
counsel?
How can a priest stop someone from getting an abortion?
Right, he can't.
You can't. However, you can have some attempt to prevent scandal and at least provide instruction.
Mm-hmm. So there should be something in the parish bulletin that says if you are considering a divorce, you're required to discuss that with your pastor or something.
Something, yeah. No one is supposed to petition in the civil forum for divorce. We're not supposed to get divorces without the bishop's permission.
Ah.
And
So
then
you listed
the bishop, so when a tribunal says we won't look at your petition for a nullity until you have your civil divorce, everybody needs to backtrack and say you can't get your civil divorce until you have permission from your bishop. You can't get your civil divorce unless you have a morally legitimate reason for separation of spouses. If you want your civil divorce because you're unhappy, well, then you're in a pickle, because the solution to your situation is not divorce and annulment. The solution to your situation is to work with those who have experience helping couples.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said there were 3 reasons for separation. You listed one. What are the other 2?
Well, adultery is a standalone one. That's one reason for separation. The other reason is canon law says when the other spouse causes moral or physical harm or makes common conjugal life unduly difficult, and because that phrase is something that is open to interpretation, I look to the interpretation that's recommended by the Pontifical Council of Legislative Texts. I'm sorry, Steve, this is just long-winded because I'm trying to get to the bottom line. The bottom line is, unless adultery is committed, the only other reason someone can be separated is if 3 things are happening. Something has to be dangerous, it has to be repeated, and separation has to be the only way to be in safety.
Okay, so that's...
So abusive, grave abuse, serious physical abuse is a reason for separation of spouses.
Okay, sure. And alcoholism is a typical problem leading to abuse, right?
I'm no expert on that one, but if it is, if there's physical, dangerous abuse going on, then the innocent party is not obligated to stay in the situation. I mean, that makes common sense.
Right.
And then the other challenge is that in the old days, civil divorce decrees were in accord with divine law and natural law, and now civil divorce decrees have no recognition of the obligations of spouses towards each other. And what I mean by that is, if the civil divorce decree was trying to come up with a solution to a separation that was in accord with divine law, well, what would happen if a husband's committing adultery with some lady he met at work? Should those kids be required to spend overnight visits with dad and the new adultering partner, according to divine law and natural law? What do you think?
No.
Yeah, I know, but in civil court that happens all the time. Or say a woman wants to dump her husband because she is just unhappy. He's not doing anything dangerous. He's not committing adultery. She's really unhappy, and she blames him. So should she be allowed to take the children away from him most of the time? What do you think, according to divine law and natural law?
I would think not.
Right. But in the civil forum, in the civil divorce courts, those kind of issues never even come up.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's treated the same. It's cookie cutter. There's no recognition for a spouse to continue to uphold their obligations towards the family. So, I mean, if I know women whose husband, and I know both of these go both ways, so I'm not trying to pick on men or women, but if a woman's husband decides he wants to leave and he's going to go have an adulterous affair, the civil court might require him to pay some child and spousal support, but it's only a fraction of his income. And most of his income he's spending with his new partner and his new life, his new single life. Mm-hmm. So, if we were trying to make separation decrees that were in accord with divine law, the outcome regarding support and property division would be different. So one of the ideas that Mary's Advocates is pushing, which we know is pioneering, is that couples could sign something. You know, part of premarital preparation and premarital investigation is couples could be taught about the canon laws of separation of spouses. And they could sign something that would have the weight and the teeth of a prenuptial agreement. But it's not a prenuptial agreement saying, you know, who's going to keep the property when they get divorced. It's a prenuptial agreement saying we want to hold ourselves to our obligations according to the church law about marriage. And the hope would be that if one of those people years down the road decides to abandon the marriage, they've got a written agreement where they both sign saying they want to be held to the obligations that the church would require them to have. I mean, it's just an attempt to try to minimize the damage that no-fault divorce courts have. Another thing that Mary's Advocates is trying to do to strengthen marriage is to let people know that amongst Catholics, you can ask the bishop to help you. Canon law says that we can petition the bishop and ask him to intervene. And there's canon law that talks about the pastors and the church's obligation to try to facilitate reconciliation.
Well, that's very interesting. Yeah. Bishops have a lot to do. Bishops could be pretty busy doing that. But you're also questioning and challenging the civil court system, the civil divorce system, in a way. Do you expend much energy in that direction, or is it primarily, I would expect, to change the way the Catholic Church works?
No, I don't spend a lot of energy trying to confront the civil system other than inviting people to put something in writing that they don't want to be there. And that hasn't ever really gotten off the ground very much. A constitutional law expert who was one of the co-founders of Ave Maria Law School wrote us language that has this teeth. It's like a prenuptial agreement that I said. He composed the language in that. I'm more interested now in trying to publicize the option to invoke the church, asking the church to stop breakup of marriages.
And how successful is that effort? Are you getting some cooperation from dioceses? You almost have to go diocese to diocese, or do you work with the USCCB and try to get some kind of broad, universal, national policy change?
Well, Steve, I don't have any diocesan official who's willing to endorse us in writing. So the only efforts I've been able to move forward on is ones that are just out on the internet, doing like what we're doing now, where through the internet we can connect with people who want to try to save their marriage. Like this petition asking the bishop to stop a breakup, that's available from our website. Anyone could download that, and if they use it, I don't know the outcome unless they decide to tell me.
Okay. Your website is Mary's Advocates?
Mary's Advocates.
Okay. Just Google Mary's Advocates and it'll come up.
Yep. And then there's something up there that's the petition asking the bishop to stop a breakup. Because what's confusing is we hear from Catholic officials that those who are divorced are free to receive Holy Communion. It's only problematic when somebody is in a second union. Only those people are not supposed to receive Holy Communion. And, you know, between you and me, we know we don't hear all that much said about that either, but at least getting some news coverage now. I mean, and the whole thing about receiving Holy Communion is we are only supposed to receive Holy Communion when we're trying to follow Christ's plan for our lives and trust the church on what's true. Mm-hmm. So to say that when church officials say that divorced people are free to receive communion, and they leave that as a standalone statement, it makes it look like the church condones everybody who's getting divorced, who is the petitioner, a defendant, a plaintiff. Everyone who's been divorced is free to receive communion. And what's missing is making the distinction between an abandoner and a faithful spouse. There's a distinction between the person who had a morally legitimate reason to separate, like someone's an abusive alcoholic, compared to the alcoholic himself, or the person who's committing adultery, or the person who just abandoned marriage for no legitimate reason. And I'm asking the church to stop saying all divorced people are in good standing with the church, because there's a difference between an abandoner and a faithful spouse.
Mm-hmm.
And the more the church remains silent on this, the more it gives scandal, because outside observers, or even the person who's unhappy, thinks, oh, the solution to my situation is that I need a new partner.
Mm-hmm. Well, no one who is not in a state of grace should be receiving Holy Communion. Anybody that's committing objectively mortal sin should not be receiving communion. So that applies not just to divorced and remarried without annulments. It applies to fornicators, adulterers, murderers, etc.
Right.
But today, everybody goes to communion.
I know, and it's a long uphill battle to try to help straighten that out. When I'm doing my talk in the symposium at Rome, and I'm talking about canon law and marriage, I give examples of some of the written answers that chanceries or bishops have given. When one party asked for help to reconcile the marriage, in my talk in Rome, I'm going to be quoting some of the things that a bishop or chancery's office has said, answering back saying, no, we're not going to help you. Like there was one guy who wrote to his bishop asking the bishop for help in reconciling, and the answer he got back in the chancery was, well, a priest talked to your wife, or, the woman. A priest talked to the woman's not interested in reconciling, and we're not going to issue you any kind of separation decree where she's designated as an abandoner, because if the church did that, then she would no longer have a right to apply for annulment. I mean, let me restate that in a different way. A husband's asking the church for help, and instead the church comes back and says, well, we talked to your wife, she's not interested in reconciling, and by the way, if we told her she was an abandoner, then she loses her right to apply for annulment. I mean, this is totally upside down and not right. But, I've got this in writing from this one man.
Mm-hmm.
And I have another situation where some people wrote to a bishop asking the bishop to intervene, and the bishop comes back and he chastises the people writing the letter, saying, you shouldn't be calling this husband an offender because he has a right to his good name. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, what if somebody really was doing something terrible? And you asked the bishop for help, and the bishop came back and said, shame on you for calling him an offender. It makes me scratch my head.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a way of changing the subject. It's like, whatever. There's lots of ways people do that. Attack the messenger, attack the logic, and ignore the fundamental issue. But
and this bishop also had said that divorce is not a delict. Delict is a canon law word that means crime. So the bishop came back and said divorce is not a delict in canon law, because the people who wrote to him had mentioned the same canon that denies communion to other people who are in grave manifest sin. And the bishop just said no to everything. He didn't even do an investigation. He just said no.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, do you know the scripture from Matthew 18? It teaches what we're supposed to do when someone offends us.
Yes.
Like,
mm-hmm.
you go to the person first.
Right.
And if you don't get anywhere, then you bring other people. And then if you don't get anywhere, you go to the church.
Mm-hmm.
And in Matthew, it teaches that the church would try to help the situation, but if the person who's committing the offenses won't even listen to the church, then we should treat them like a tax collector and a Gentile. And what's happening to the people who I'm reporting about in Rome, what's happening to them is they're going to the church asking for help, and the church is doing absolutely nothing.
Mm-hmm.
which leads everyone to conclude that abandonment is okay, all divorce is okay, civil divorce is okay, no-fault divorce is okay. I'm sorry, I'm talking too fast.
Can you give us any examples of dioceses that do offer some constructive help?
I know of a case right now, I don't want to name names, where a spouse wrote to the bishop asking for help. The bishop designated a staff person to do an investigation. The abandoning spouse did visit. Both spouses have been interviewed down at the chancery offices, and the bishop did write a letter to the abandoning spouse informing the abandoning spouse that you do not have the church's permission to petition to file for divorce, and divorce is a grave offense against nature and immoral. And those last three words are exactly what the Catechism says. Divorce is a grave offense against nature and immoral, except in situations that are in accord with divine law, like the alcoholic abuser who needs to be removed and the children need to be protected. Mm-hmm. So I know of one case where it's moving along, whether the abandoning spouse is moved to work on reconciling or whether an abandoning spouse continues in their obstinate perseverance to destroy their own family, that's where we don't know what the person's going to choose. But I would rather have a church instructing someone who's doing something destructive, hey, what you're doing is destructive. That's an improvement than overdoing nothing.
Mm-hmm. You're doing something that's destructive. How can we help you change your behavior? How can we, the church has retrovale, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, for couples that are having troubles.
Right. And in the Mary's Advocates template petition, where someone can petition the bishop asking for help in stopping a breakup, the first part of that template petition cites canon law, asking the bishop to do what you just said. Help the couple. Help point them to sources that can help them, like retrovai. Mm-hmm. And it's only after that fails that the next step in the petition is to call a spade a spade. And the hope is always that the person who's doing the destructive thing will have an epiphany and work on doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. So you've had Mary's Advocates in existence for 10 years.
Yeah.
Do you have some? I guess you would say would it be correct to say that Mary's Advocates advocates bringing couples back together? And
absolutely, yeah.
And have you had some success in that goal?
Some.
Not a lot.
I'm thinking of a situation. You're right. Not a lot. This whole thing has been pioneering since I've been doing it. I'm thinking of a case where a woman's husband, he was having issues that were troublesome. He had left the marriage. Everywhere she turned was telling her that she needs to be divorced and get an annulment. And we were the only ones who were supporting her. And when I say we support people, there's two ways we do it. One is we have an email discussion group, a Yahoo group. So over the years, different people have joined this Yahoo group, and they share their story and ask for advice, and a number of us will respond back. So in that woman's case, she was so appreciative to have anybody who's supporting her and trying to keep her marriage together. And eventually her husband and she did get back together again. Mm-hmm. And there's another case I'm thinking of where the wife was a very serious Catholic, and so was the husband. And for whatever reason, she wanted to get a divorce, and she petitioned for an annulment. And the husband had done his homework, and he knew how to defend a marriage in a nullity case. And it ended up being that the nullity case was dropped, and they got back together again.
Well, it reminds me of a study, and I don't know the authors or how long ago it was, but I think it was about a cohort of about 1,000 couples that were in troubled marriages, and then they're all considering divorce. Then 10 years later or so, they went back and interviewed these same couples, and about half of them had been divorced, and the other half had not. and they asked questions about their happiness. It turned out that the couples that had stayed married were judged to be happier than the ones that had divorced. So it would seem like, I mean, based on that one study, and you know, it would seem like there would be good reason for the church to discourage divorce as much as possible, and not hold out annulment so readily as a Catholic form of divorce or whatever. Uh, to keep marriages together, to prevent the social and cultural and spiritual tragedy of divorce that we see in our society today.
You are so right. I've heard of that study too, and it's kind of counterintuitive when somebody's feeling very unhappy in their marriage. I'm just guessing that the pain must be really strong, and they want to escape the pain.
Mm-hmm.
But if the church, especially for people who care about being Catholic, I mean, those are the only audience that I really think I have any chance of helping. For those people who care about being Catholic and trust Jesus guides the church, if those people knew, hey, I'm not the first person who is very unhappy in my marriage, what can I do to help improve the situation? And that's where they went instead of, divorce lawyers. That we could have families stay together. That's what I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about families staying together. I'm passionate about people who are sad in their marriage, looking towards resources that can help them keep their marriage together. I'm also passionate about supporting those who put up with a lot of grief from a spouse, though maybe it's not a reason for permanent separation of spouses. Like one of the people who participates in our monthly conference calls is this lady who's dating her husband, though they've been divorced for 8 years. So the husband left a long time ago. He forced her through a no-fault divorce. Sometime during that time, he did have a new girlfriend. The wife is concerned that he was committing adultery, but she doesn't want to think about that. But, that relationship is over. So she and the husband are dating. They're civilly divorced. She knows that they're husband and wife. He thinks they're just boyfriend and girlfriend. So she puts up with a lot of, that's a lot of, how many wives are going to put up with that kind of thing? But when I hear her talk about how she has to keep her mouth shut when her husband might say something that bothers her, he's not beating her up, but he's not living with her, and that's not nice. I see her as a model of how we love people. She's doing what Jesus talks about when you love the person that doesn't love you back. At least not the way they promised when they got married. And that's what I'm passionate about.
Well, there are, I guess, numerous cases one could look for of couples where one or the other has committed adultery, which is an annullable reason, I guess. And they get back together. The offended couple, the offended spouse forgives the wrongdoer, and they get back together,
Right. That's Jesus' way. And even in canon law, though I said that in canon law, adultery is one of the offenses against marriage that's bad enough that it provides justification for separation of spouses for the innocent spouse. But even the canon law says that reconciliation is encouraged. And if a couple stays together 6 months after the adultery has been known, then it's presumed that forgiveness and reconciliation has occurred. Mm-hmm. The church wants reconciliation. It doesn't want separation. And even if someone does commit adultery, that has nothing to do with whether or not they're still married. That's not grounds for annulment. Mm-hmm. I've heard that one spread.
I've heard of couples that were divorced but still living together.
Yeah, I heard of one of those.
So they changed their mind, but they didn't bother to go back and get remarried.
Well, Steve, one of the things about marriage now in the civil forum, I think it's kind of a joke, because marriage has nothing to do with sexual fidelity. It has nothing to do with permanence. Now it doesn't even have anything to do with the ability to have and bear children with this supposed gay marriage thing. What is this marriage in the civil forum? I think it's just boiled down to a status where you've got some liabilities and shared debt and maybe some health insurance benefits. You might have tax benefits. You might have tax penalties. It's like marriage doesn't mean marriage anymore in the civil system.
Right. Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And in a way, it does. In a way, it means less in the Catholic Church today when we don't speak about contraception from the pulpit. We don't treat that as it's abandoning the very act that God created to be the essence of marriage. It's hollowing it out. It's destroying it and making it counterfeit. I would argue that couples that use contraception have kind of annulled their marriage, or they've kind of changed it in some fundamental way by using contraception.
Well, I've never seen anything written about that from the sources that I trust, like Cardinal Raymond Burke or Roman Rota judges, because marriage requires the openness to having children. So if someone consented to marriage intending to never have children, and they were contracepting and that was their way of doing it, then you're onto something there.
Well, a young priest in California who had the job in this parish of preparing couples for marriage and also counseling couples who were in troubled marriages, said that he never had a couple come to him with a troubled marriage unless they were contracepting. Every couple that ever came to him with a troubled marriage was contracepting. And I can see why that's true, because they're destroying the very act that is the essence of marriage. But, I mean, that's just an anecdotal point. He also said that he never had any couple come to him with a troubled marriage that was using natural family planning. So, I don't know. I think the act of sexual intercourse, how that's engaged in and how it's treated, is fundamental to this whole issue of separation, divorce, annulment, whatever. The other priest on the tribunal says that every couple that they see is contracepting. So again, these are just anecdotal. I haven't done a study, and I don't think you have either, on this issue. But it'd be interesting to have somebody do a doctoral dissertation on what are tribunals finding in common. Do they even ask these questions that are so fundamental?
And then, are they grounds for nullity is another question. There were 2 books that were published this summer that are authoritative that I really appreciate. And one of them is published by Catholic University of America. It's by the retired Roman Rota judge Cormac Burke. It's got an endorsement from Cardinal Timothy Dolan and a preface by Janet Smith, or a foreword by Janet Smith. It's Cormac Burke's book, The Theology of Marriage, Personalism, Doctrine, and Canon Law. And in the whole last part of the book, he's talking about the right understanding of sexuality, and he's talking about concupiscence and the possibility of sinning in sexuality. And even people who are married, say like if they're contracepting, they're using each other. They're not doing that which marriage was intended to do, because they're using each other as a physical entertainment, sort of.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like mutual masturbation.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of challenges out here, aren't there, Steve?
Hey, we're getting close to the end of our time together, and Radio Maria New York suggested that we pray the prayer that Pope Francis wrote, and today is being celebrated, declared as World Day of Commitment to Creation or something like that the Pope has designated. So I'd like to say this prayer, and if we have any time left at the end, you'll get you can use that as you wish. A Christian prayer in union with creation by Pope Francis. Father, we praise you with all your creatures. They came forth from your all-powerful hand. They are yours, filled with your presence and your tender love. Praise be to you. Son of God, Jesus, through you all things were made. You were formed in the womb of Mary, our mother. You became part of this earth, and you gazed upon this world with human eyes. Today you are alive, and every creature in your risen glory. Praise be to you. Holy Spirit, by your light, you guide this world toward the Father's love and accompany creation as it groans in travail. You also dwell in our hearts, and you inspire us to do what is good. Praise be to you. Triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe, for all things speak of you. Awaken our praise and thankfulness for every being that you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. God of love, show us your place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor in the earth are crying out, O Lord. Seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom, of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen. So we have about a minute, Bai. What would you like to say in a minute?
I'm pleading that the church start applying our own canon law on separation of spouses and divorce. And for anyone who's in a situation where they know somebody where a professed Catholic is contemplating forcing their family through a no-fault divorce where there's no adultery or abuse, I ask those people to publicize the existence of a petition, a formal petition that we have on Mary's Advocates, asking the bishop to intervene. Because I think that's one way that we could help stop somebody from forcing a divorce on their family. And then the other thing is, if you know anybody who's faithful to marriage and knows that they're still married even though they're separated and divorced, bring them to Mary's Advocates, and because they'll be happy to find us. I know.
Yes. You're providing a worthwhile resource for people that are hurting, and so I salute you and I thank you, and I hope our listeners appreciate what you're doing and can avail themselves of the resources you're offering at your website, Mary's Advocate. Go to it. Thank you, Bai.
Yep.
Have a great day.
Steve. Thank you. Bye.
God bless you, Radio Maria listeners.